Dr. Paul Andrew Hutton joins me now. The West is a mixture of cultures. Who do you think, out of all the legendary characters of the past, has had the most influence, would you say, on how we view the Old West now?
Oh, there are so many characters that have become so famous. And what's interesting about Western history, especially over the last quarter century in particular, and certainly in the future, is that it's changing. History changes all the time, of course, because as a nation changes, as the demographics of a nation change, the history, which is the story of a people, changes to meet the new needs of the new population. So for instance, I was reading this morning in the paper that within 20 years, over 30% of the population is going to be Hispanic. Well, that's going to cause a rewriting of American history because suddenly the Hispanic story in America is vitally important. We'll see a shift in that. We see that in the sort of shifting heroes. At one time, General George Custer was certainly one of the most famous Western heroes, internationally famous, and he has morphed, again, in about the last half century, into a villain of Western history.
I was going to say, that really changed.
And while someone like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, who of course defeated Custer, and Geronimo down here in the Southwest have become huge heroes. And so we've seen a real shift in what is an acceptable Western hero. And of course here in New Mexico we have the classic example in Kit Carson, who certainly is one of the great figures of American history. And I think you take Daniel Boone and you take Davy Crockett and you take Buffalo Bill, you roll them all together, you still don't have someone as important and impressive as Kit Carson, who did so much in his life to shape our country today and had so many unbelievable adventures. Well, here in New Mexico, of course, Carson is a villain. Not so much outside of New Mexico, he's simply forgotten. One of the reasons? New Mexico doesn't promote him. We promote our own peculiar hero, Billy the Kid.
Billy the Kid, I was just going to say.
We have a Billy the Kid Byway. We have two state monuments that are devoted to Billy the Kid. There's even a Billy the Kid casino, which Billy would love. And so that's an acceptable sort of Western hero figure for us to promote, but not Kit Carson. His home up in Taos, which is a fabulous historic site, is run by the Masonic Lodge. It receives no state funds, and they've done a wonderful job with it. But it's a very telling comment on how delicate the history of a place is and how careful people are in terms of the way they approach it, and how stories change. Stories change over time. If they didn't, I wouldn't have a job. Someone already did this story.
That's a good thing, it does.
Yeah.
Well, and it's almost more of a popularity contest, depending on, the excitement of the story or what it generates for people's memory.
That's right. One of the things that fascinates me, especially about Western heroes, and I've written a lot about Western heroes, is how they change over time and what that then tells us about the people who either admire them or don't admire them. What's going on? And so sometimes if we study history, it tells us more about ourselves today, where we're going, than it tells us about where we've been.
What is it about, as you seem to allude to, about lawmen, the good guys, the bad guys, the outlaws of the Old West, that we as a society sort of hold in such high regard?
Well, the story of the Old West is a very, very colorful and romantic period of history. It's why I was captivated by it as a child, and lots of other people have been. It's just a great story, and the characters are larger than life, and of course the forces that they were up against seem so incredible, and they actually become, I think for Americans especially, almost a creation myth, like the ancient Greeks had the story of Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece, or the English had King Arthur and Camelot. This is how a nation forms an identity. And one of the most difficult things for a nation of immigrants and for a new nation, and we're both, is that we had no identity. Who are we? Well, certainly in the 19th century and for much of the 20th century, it was the story of the West who told us who we were. And so Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and Wild Bill Hickok and Jesse James, these became our Hector, our Achilles. These became our great legendary figures. And the real stories are pretty impressive. The real stories are pretty amazing. And it doesn't take too much work to embellish them and make them even better, more motion pictures made about Billy the Kid than any other historical character in American history.
How do we separate legend from myth, or fact from fiction when you're talking about these historic events?
Well, one of the things I worry about my field in terms of academic Western history is that I think a lot of my colleagues in the field work very hard to take all of the romance and all the excitement out of the story of the West. And indeed, they're sort of killing, the goose that lays the golden egg for Western history. But certainly in the broader sort of popular mindset, as we've seen with the success of Lonesome Dove, of Stephen Ambrose's books on the West, Undaunted Courage, of books, about Custer and Blood and Thunder, Hampton Side's recent book on Kit Carson, there's still a huge appeal. One of my favorite Western films is The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance with John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart. And it's the story of a Western legend that's proven false. And at the conclusion of the film, when it turns out that Jimmy Stewart, the senator from Wyoming, is not the man who shot Liberty Valance after all, and that his whole career had been built on a lie, the newspaper reporter tears up his notes from the interview and says, in words written for him by the screenwriter James Warner-Bella, "This is the West, sir. When legend becomes fact, we print the legend." And there's a lot of that. And as a Western historian, there's always a push, a pull, a tug as you try and balance that out. You want to have the excitement, but you also want to tell real stories about real people, because that's what resonates.
Now, in the old days, New Mexico was actually the center of the mix of culture, and as you were saying, that hasn't changed much. I guess it comes in and out of popularity with who the characters are and the players.
It was here in the West that the America we know today was already being formed. And actually, I don't know what this means for the future, but of course it was the Wild West. People, it was pretty grim. Folks don't get along sometimes.
Often end up with a hanging in the town square.
Yeah. And so that's part of the story, and we don't want to skip over that. But I think there's a positive point to be seen in how the West was the forerunner of the new America. It's always been that way. And I think that one of the things all Americans do, you can come from anywhere. I'm an orphan from Germany. I came over on the boat in 1952. But do you buy into the story? Do you embrace what it means to be an American? Do you kind of go into that secular religion that we have about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, who we are as a people, about the sort of fundamental values of America? And do you buy into the story of America? Part of that story, a major part of it, is the story of the American West. And people do. And so history, the story of the West, brings us together. It's a shared story that no matter where you're from, you can kind of, you can buy into it. You can buy into the resistance of Geronimo, Custer's last stand, the Battle of the Alamo, the pioneers going west, the struggles of the gold. These are all stories that people relate to.
Do you think we're subject to historical revisionism, when historians and novelists write about historical characters from the West?
We can certainly see it here in New Mexico with the story of Geronimo, one of the most famous New Mexicans that ever lived. He was born down around where Silver City is, and Geronimo, of course, was once seen as one of the great villains of American history, and the last holdout. And so frightening was he to the people of the Southwest that when they removed him from Arizona and sent him first to Florida and then finally to Oklahoma, they kept him as a prisoner of war till the day he died, and they never allowed his Chiricahua people, who were exiled with him, to return to their homeland. And so now he's a hero, and
suffered much in those later years. Yeah,
he did. Although it's sort of interesting. This goes to what we were talking about earlier in terms of legends and the sort of romance of the West. He actually did really well. He died with $10,000 in the bank.
Really?
Yeah. He went on the road. He went to fairs. He went to World's Fairs. He was at the World's Fair where McKinley was shot. He led the inaugural parade for Theodore Roosevelt
Oh my gosh.
along with Quanah Parker.
It was
And,
left out of
and
the
two
history
other-
I read of him, I guess.
Yeah, so he became very famous. He did very well.
Wow.
And he used to sell his autograph.
Wow.
And so he prospered. He was a smart guy. And once he had this new life and he had this new role to play, he embraced it. And after he did the parade for Roosevelt, he got to meet the president, of course, and he asked him again to, this is 1904, he asked him again to send he and his people back home to Arizona, and Roosevelt said, I can't do it. Someone would kill you.
Wow.
Because, feelings are still so bad.
Probably wasn't a popular move for Roosevelt at the time.
And he
either.
wasn't about to do it either, yeah. So. But he liked having them in the parade. He liked
I'm sure that
the
was
pizzazz of that.
Really big
Yeah.
draw. What are you working on now, Paul?
Speaking of Geronimo, I'm doing a history of the Apache Wars, and I'm taking it from, actually I'm going back into New Mexico history to the wars with the Jicarillas and the Mescaleros in the 1850s. So the main part of my story is from 1860 onward, and it's the War for the Southwest, the longest war America ever fought, 25 years, between the Apaches and the United States. Finally, at the end, there were 5,000 American troops combing the Southwest looking for Geronimo and 34 warriors by the time it was over. And I've got a fascinating through character that I'm using. And he was a young boy who was on a ranch in southern Arizona who was kidnapped. A young lieutenant, fresh from West Point, goes out to demand that Cochise, the great Apache chief, return the boy. And Cochise says, I don't have him, but I'll find out where he is and I'll get him for you. And this young lieutenant says, oh no, you won't. We're going to hold you hostage. And Cochise cut his way out of the tent and escaped with bullets flying after him. But his brother and several other members of his family were captured. And the young lieutenant hangs them to force Cochise to bring the boy, and Cochise didn't have the boy. Well, the boy is raised by the Apaches and becomes an Apache warrior, and then when the Army is fighting, 15 years later, he becomes one of the major scouts. And they give him a name, because the Army would give the Apache scouts names. One was named Peaches, one was named Fun, and they give him the name Mickey Free, which is just a wonderful name. And he's one-eyed, he only has one eye, and he's one of these perfect characters who's caught between all these worlds. And everyone, both the Apaches and the white people, blame him for the war.
Oh my
because we all have been killing each other for 25 years over this kid, over him being kidnapped. So they all hated him, but they all needed him. So
It's a great story.
Yeah, he's my through character, and he's sort of a Forrest Gump. He runs all the way through from the beginning, obviously, of the war to its end with the last outbreak, which is another Indian scout, one of his friends, who's called the Apache Kid, who, even after Geronimo is imprisoned and sent back east, breaks out and becomes a famous renegade in the Southwest. And his troubles are all over a beautiful woman, and finally he rescues her from the Army and escapes into the mountains of Mexico in the midst of legend, and so that's how my story ends.
Thank you, Dr. Hutton. I think that's been a very fascinating story, and I look forward to seeing your book. Good luck finishing it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.